My father had a pretty serious stroke back in 2004, was unconscious for about 2 weeks, and spent a total of almost 3 months in the hospital. I used to visit him every day from morning until night. We didn't have any insurance at the time, so he had to stay in a ward with up to 7 other patients at a time, although usually it was 3 to 4 patients. One of the patients was a man in his mid to late 60s. He was a very kind man whose bed was directly in front of my father's. One day I came back from a quick lunch break only to find my father sleeping, and there was nothing on the TV for me to watch. I was bored and sort of zoned out, staring in the general direction of the elderly patient in front of me, who happened to be getting a visit from his kids and grandchildren. As I was zoned out, I started to notice something floating above this man. I looked up and saw 3 shadowy figures floating in a circular pattern around him. They looked like 3 people wearing dark cloaks but with no hands or feet, and seemed to be diving in and out of a hole I couldn't see. One moment they would disappear into the hole, and the next they would pop right back out. I sat there stunned as I watched this, and that's when one of them broke off from the 3 and floated in my direction. It got right in my face, and I just backed my head as far back as I could in the chair I was sitting in. After that it floated back to the other 3, and then they all went out the back wall and disappeared. I had the most sickening feeling that this man was going to die. I just knew that these things were there because he wasn't going to make it. The elderly patient had been fine the whole time I had known him, but later that night he started complaining about stomach pains. The next day he was moved to the private room next to ours, and the day after that I ran into his daughter who was crying her eyes out. Knowing the answer, I asked her what's wrong. She said, "My father died today. He was fine, and then he just got sicker and died. We still don't know what happened." I felt so sad for her and that lovely family, but there was no point in telling her what I saw, so I kept it to myself. To this day, I'm still not sure of what I saw, but it was pretty disturbing if I'm being honest. During my tenure as a nurse manager at a community nursing home, I encountered an inexplicable occurrence while covering for a sick supervisor during the night shift. At precisely 0250, an unnerving symphony began, as every door alarm simultaneously erupted into frantic buzzing. Initial disbelief led me to suspect a system malfunction, because the scenario of multiple residents attempting an escape seemed implausible. I rallied my team, particularly the newer members, to inspect each door. The relentless alarms persisted for an agonizing 20 minutes until a veteran CNA returned from her break. She assessed the chaos, the alarms, and then me, clutching the control box, and declared matter-of-factly, "Open the window. Colleen wants out." Skepticism made her insistence seem like a dark joke, but her intensifying urgency couldn't be ignored. "She'll grow angry. Open the window." Compelled, I opened the window. In an instant, the alarm ceased across every floor, right down to the basement, and all was quiet again. The memory sends shivers down my spine to this day, heightened by the image of the opened window's curtains billowing, as though a presence had swept through them, chasing an unseen escape. Colleen, as it turned out, was a centenarian pioneer resident of our home, passing away at 108 with no kin to mourn her. That night, it seemed she had one last journey to make. On a quiet night in OB with no patients to attend to, my colleague Jeannie and I dedicated ourselves to restocking supplies and conducting routine checks, anticipating a relaxed shift ahead. While Jeannie handled the labor rooms, I took charge of the nursery, focusing particularly on the special care section nestled at the back. It was there, amidst the silence, that a gentle whisper carrying my name broke the stillness. Assuming it was Jeannie, I ventured toward the desk area, finding it unexpectedly empty. Shrugging off the peculiarity, I returned to my tasks in the special care unit. Moments later, Jeannie appeared, a puzzled look crossing her features. "Did you call for me?" she inquired. As we exchanged stories, a chill crept over us. She heard her name in the same tender murmur that I heard mine. We found ourselves grappling with an unsettling realization. Our unit, secured for infant protection, couldn't be breached by outsiders. Yet the whispered name, soft as a sigh, left us questioning if, perhaps, we weren't as alone as we believed. Haley had a patient who was very pleasing to the eyes. She was very cantankerous, though, and after a while, the nurses would roll their eyes when he was mentioned, except Haley, who had the patience of a saint. The handsome patient liked to torment she as a result and teased and aggravated her in varying degrees. She stayed for quite a while in the hospital due to complications. One night, coming from a rest day, Haley made a detour to the bathroom before her shift. After washing her hands, she looked up, and under the full glow of the fluorescent lights, she saw her patient's handsome face behind her reflected clearly in the bathroom mirror. Haley was smiling maniacally as if taunting her. She was hugely startled, and turning swiftly to berate him, she was surprised to find herself alone in the small tiled bathroom. Thinking her patient was pranking her, Haley's mind was blown later when she received the news that her handsome patient had passed the night before. For several weeks after, she did not look at any mirrors, especially at night. A patient was suffering from many illnesses. Many patients are afraid to die, but he stood out very much. When his monitors beeped warning signals, he would rage at the nurses, screaming, "Don't let me die! Don't let me die!" Later, Nurse Jessica and the other nurses found out why he was supremely agitated. At 0200, the man's cardiac monitor starts alarming VTAC. Nurse Jessica and another nurse quickly went to his room, with Nurse Jessica following closely behind because she was pulling the crash cart. She bumped into the first nurse, whom she noticed had turned very pale. When she looked at the bed, their patient was sitting 2 inches above the bed. He was laughing with a demonic look on his face. He said, "You stupid buckies aren't going to let me die, will you?" He kept laughing, and Nurse Jessica recounted how they were frozen to the spot. Still, she managed to hit code blue, and suddenly, their patient went into VFib, crashing back into the bed as he did so. The nurses started coding him, but it was called after 20 minutes. 5 minutes later, the staff is cleaning up when the dead man sits up suddenly. He said while laughing maniacally, "You let him die. Too bad." Their patient suddenly gave an agonized scream, and everybody heard whispers of, "Don't let me die." Nurse Jessica recounted, "The night shift nurses had a prayer service in the break room before we left for home, and then we all had nightmares for weeks." I'm an ER nurse. I had an old lady come in by ambulance near death. She was a DNR, so we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find. The hospital was full, so we had to keep her in the ER for the night. Again, she was near death. When you've seen enough people die, there's no mistaking it, and she was almost there. Barely responsive, pale, cool, breaths were really irregular. Heart rate was up and down too. We just turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor, basically waiting for her to die. About an hour later, she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all her clothes. We were all like, "What the fuck?" One of the nurses went to check on her, and she said she was hungry. Not knowing really what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and went to the cafeteria and got her a tray of food. Lady sat there, ate all her food, talked with the staff a little. After about an hour, she told her nurse that she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, and within 30 minutes, she was dead. Not exactly paranormal, but in 22 years in busy-ass inner-city ERs, it's the weirdest thing I've seen. Nurse here. I worked the night shift when a ward patient's relative came running to the nurse's station in a panic. "Nurse, come quick," she cried. "What happened? You have to see it for yourself." I ran to the ward where this little old lady patient was crying and holding onto the bed for dear life. Her bed was shaking. Now you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking. But she was this frail, practically emaciated thing. She couldn't have barely rattled the bed rails. The ward had only 2 other patients in it and their respective watchers. Everyone was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright. Apparently that particular ward was seldom used, and the bed that old lady lay in was rarely occupied. People who have laid in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirit called dibs on that particular bed. I worked for a short time as an emergency who spent most of my time with transfers. I had a regular who was an older woman that I took to a dialysis center across town frequently. One day, she was being moved, and I was in the back with her. She looked under the weather, so I asked what was wrong, and she said a man in purple had been visiting her. I asked if he was a relative or a technician, and she shook her head. She said the man would sit next to her during dialysis and stroke her hair. Thinking this was strange, I asked the center techs about such a person, and no one had seen or remembered such a person. Visitors weren't really a thing at this center anyway, so I assumed the patient was imagining it. Well, one day we're actually heading to pick her up, and on the way into the parking lot, I see through the window something that chills my heart to think about. It sent shivers up my spine at the time too, like I immediately recognized it. But I swear to God I saw a man in purple scrubs standing in one of the big windows watching us drive in. And when we pulled out of sight to go to the pickup door, we walked in to see a bunch of techs rushing to my transfer patient. The woman had just suffered a heart attack, and we were unable to revive her even at the hospital she was rushed to. None of the techs in that place wore purple scrubs. I worked at a nursing home about 8 years ago. I came in for my shift and was informed during report that a resident on hospice care would most likely be passing away during my shift. I was not on her floor, but the floor across from hers. There were 2 other girls who would be working with her that were both newly hired. I was told the resident was afraid of dying and did not want to be alone. She had expressed this extensively to the staff. Her son had been with her all day, but that evening he went to get some dinner. During his absence, I saw one of the new girls running up the hall in distress. "Something is wrong with MJ," she said, speaking of the resident. I replied in my most calm manner to explain what was going on as I followed her to MJ's room. "She isn't responding and her head is tipped to the side. She's got something coming out of her mouth," she exclaimed. Sure enough, MJ was sitting upright, her head cocked to the side. Her chest rose and fell laboriously like a fish out of water. I went and stood behind her, cradling her head next to mine. I wrapped my arms around her. Both girls were scared and speaking loudly. "She's dying," they exclaimed. I shushed them and said everything was going to be all right. I asked them to get some supplies so we could get MJ comfortable, mostly to just get them out of the room. I knew I had to be the rock, the one to call up order in the chaos. I knew MJ was close to drawing her last breath, and I knew she was terrified of being alone. I held her in my arms and I sang to her softly. I told her that everything would be all right. I said it over and over again until I could no longer feel her chest rise and fall. It was just MJ and I in that room, and now I was alone with a vessel that had once held her spirit. When the girls returned with clean linens, we carefully changed MJ, and the 3 of us worked together to lift her into her bed. I remember the odd feeling of holding her lifeless body, her slack limbs, and how the muscle no longer supported any of her joints. I felt I could not allow her head to fall backward, that even in death it was vital to keep her supported. Her son had returned and was waiting outside of the room. I knew I had to prepare her perfectly. The memory of seeing your dead loved one is a core memory you will never forget. No one ever wants to see their loved one's dead, lifeless body. That is never ever anything anyone would want to experience. I had to ensure that this tender moment was portrayed with as much dignity as possible. I combed her hair, pulled the sheets up, made sure there weren't any wrinkles in the bedding. I rested her hands on her chest and used a damp washcloth to close her eyes. When I was sure MJ looked as peaceful as possible, I opened the door and allowed him in to begin his grieving process. I have never held someone as they transitioned from one life to the next. As sad as it was, I am so glad that I could be there with her, that I could comfort her, help her let go and know that she was being cared for. I felt a deep welling in my own heart that I had done something good, I had shared with someone something that no other person was able to do in that moment. I held her while she died. I went to bed that night with a feeling of peace. At some point I began to dream, and I want to say it was early morning when I felt the presence. The vision in my dream was a chamber of light, gold flecks and taking on no shape recognizable. I knew it was her. I could feel her warmth and light, happiness like laughter. Her presence stood beside the head of my bed. She had been there all along, but now I could see her golden aura. In my dreams, I heard her feminine voice. She said thank you and slowly faded away. I could feel her spirit ascend this earth, and I knew in my heart that MJ had made a point to tell me what I did had truly comforted her.